In this video we talk about if it's still worth to start getting into FPV, how to build a premium 5-inch drone by yourself from scratch, and my biggest learnings so far which help you to save a lot of time and money and probably some drones. So let's begin with the most important question. Is it still worth to get into this entire FPV stuff? Because it is not something you can buy and fly like a normal DJI drone. You have to learn how to fly it, to build it, and even more important, to repair it or build it again because you lost it. As I saw the first few FPV shots here on YouTube, I was amazed. It is definitely a new way to get shots that aren't possible before to capture in another way. You get so dynamic and powerful shots, but at this point in time I was quite busy with my filmmaking company and other projects like producing the entire All-in Filmmaker online course, where we teach everything about filmmaking as efficient and understandable as possible, which is definitely worth to check it out. However, I knew it needs quite a bit of effort to get into this entire FPV drone stuff. Then I saw more and more cinematic videos where you see only, or should I say exclusively, FPV drone shots, which is for my taste too much or too hectic sometimes. Don't get me wrong, it looks amazing and it is a hell of fun to fly this drone, but I personally believe less is more. If you use only 1 or 2 FPV shots in an entire video or commercial, gives everything more impact than using only FPV shots, if you understand what I mean. Unless it is a release day fly-through or FPV only related video. Even if you mix FPV shots from an amazing place with normal drone shots and camera shots, it can look even better. But that is my taste and was my thought, and because of that it was not my priority to get into it. Until this year. I finally, at the beginning of this year, decided to go all in. Buy everything I need to make it possible, watched everything to learn as fast as possible all I need to know to get this drone together and up in the air. If you don't want to buy everything at once and first want to try if it is something for you, I highly recommend you to just buy the controller and the liftoff simulator. This way you can try it in the simulator until you know if it is something for you or not. Because it is definitely not the same to fly like a normal DJI drone. The controller alone sets you only $100 back, and the simulator is also very cheap. Before I flown my first FPV drone, I spent around 50 hours in the simulator, otherwise I probably had crashed it at the first flight. And the more you crash it, the more you spend, but not so in the simulator. There you can crash without spending a lot of money and time to repair it. So start slow, first in the simulator and then in reality, with learning the basics and work your way up. The goal is to never crash, especially in the real world, if you want to fly cinematic only. If you want to fly freestyle, you will crash, that's for sure a promise. And now I can proudly say I can build the drone by myself, I can fly it without crashing it, and I'm able to record some stunning shots. I still have a lot to learn, but I believe I did some progress which also you can benefit from. Now let's take first a look at all the parts I used to build my drone and put everything together, before I tell you my most important learnings out of my experience with FPV. I will link all the parts in the description as affiliate link. If you choose to build the same one, it will help this channel if you use them. I really would appreciate it if you do so. This way we earn a small percentage of every order and it doesn't cost you more. You can alternatively also buy a ready to fly drone if you don't want to build one by yourself. But at some point in time you will break something and you have to know how to repair it. Because of that, it is helpful to build one by yourself. Now the first part is the DJI 3 system, which is only a camera, this little box and an antenna. This is only here to transmit the picture from the drone to the goggles, so you can see where you are going. This is a digital system which gives you a really clear picture and a lot of reach. More is always better, but at this time I record this video, it is in my opinion the best option. There exist as well cheaper analog systems which I don't use, and because of that I can't tell a lot about it. But mostly the image can get quite noisy compared to a digital system. The downside from the digital system is if you end up with a bad connection, it can happen that you lose your picture completely. So to use the 3 system you also need some goggles. I choose the DJI goggles too. The picture is relatively big and very clear, and you even can correct it if you normally wear glasses. Only problem I noticed is I get some light leaks, especially here on the sides, which can be annoying, but it still works. So the next part is the frame itself. I choose the Foxeer Mega 5, which is a 5-inch drone. It is a good all-rounder and you can get quite far with it, and you are still heavy enough that you don't get a problem when it's windy. Important to know is if you want to use the internal DJI-03 picture in your final video, this is not the best frame for you because you see the props in the picture. I use the 03 only for the clear view through the goggles and record the footage always with the separate GoPro, which gives you slightly better image quality than the 03 itself. To use the 03 you need a H-shaped frame which moves the front props more back. This way you don't see it in the picture from the 03, but I like the handling of this shape so I go with that. Now to the brain of the drone. I use the SpeedyBee F7 stack, which is the flight controller and the 50 amp ESC. An ESC is an electric speed controller, which manages the current and the speed of the motors. There exist as well all-in-one chips which are mostly used in smaller drones. This one is quite a good quality but also not the cheapest you can get, but I prefer quality especially in a drone like this. Next to the motors, I use the GTS4 from RC & Power, which are 2207 sized and have a KV of 1960. This motor should be a good choice for a 5-inch drone. Generally, the bigger size the motors are, the bigger the drone, and the smaller sized motors, the smaller the drone. So 22 stands for the diameter of the motor and 07 for the height. kV stands for spins per volt, and mostly smaller drones with smaller motors have a higher kV than bigger ones. I'm definitely not a pro in this one, but this is my basic understanding from it. Next, the controller. I use the Radio Master Zorro, which is compact and really amazing. You can even adjust the tension in the joysticks. This was the perfect fit for me, because I don't like to have a huge controller, especially during travels. You can also choose the DJI controller, but the problem is if the signal cuts out, you lose not only the picture but also the control, which can end very badly. Because of that, I recommend you to use two systems, one only for the picture and one for the control of the drone. This way, even if you lose the video signal, you can throttle up, and through that the drone is higher up in the sky, you mostly can reconnect the video signal, especially if there was an obstacle between the drone and yourself. Which brings me to the next part, the signal receiver in the drone. I use the Radio Master RP1 version 2. This is only a small chip with an antenna that receives the stick inputs from the controller. There are also other systems like Crossfire, but I personally have only experience with the LRS and I'm quite happy with it. Next, I decided to build the drone with the GPS unit. This way you can get quite simple return to home options, which are by far not as reliable as the return to home from DJI, but better than nothing. There is also the option that you see the last coordinates from the drone on the controller, in case you have to search it after a crash, which is very useful. I use the M10 GPS from Gappersea, and because the frame doesn't have any GPS holder, I need to order such a 3D print as well. And as an additional security feature, I ordered a beeper, which will beep even if the drone loses the battery, because it has an inbuilt battery which beeps if it loses power until you press on the button. The props I use for this build are the Chamfan Hurricane for 5-inch drones, the exact model number you see here, and you can experiment with different pitched props, but I like this model a lot. Then next I use a 3D printed case for the GoPro to mount it on the drone and the GoPro itself. I use a GoPro Hero 11 and the ND filter kit, which is a must-have if you want to film seriously with it. And then you need as well batteries. I use the Tattu R-Line version 5 6S batteries with 1400 mAh. Make sure to get at least 3 pieces, because you probably can expect a flight time from 5 minutes maximum out of one battery pack. If you need more flight time, you need more batteries. 6S means the battery has 6 individual cells in it. There are also 4S and 2S, which has less power and lasts not that long. They are mostly used in smaller drones. The charger I use is the ISDT608AC, which I never had any problems with it, everything is perfect. Very important here is to learn how to handle and charge LiPo batteries correctly, because it can get quite dangerous and no one wants to set their own home on fire. A fully charged LiPo battery is shown with 4.2 volts per cell. I personally landed around 3.6 volts and never go lower than 3.4 volts, otherwise it can happen that you lose the power completely and the drone will fall from the sky. And on top, the battery will probably be damaged. And the very important point is to always stay close during the charging process and store the batteries at the storage voltage of 3.8 volts per cell. in a safe place. If it lights up, then nothing happens. I store mine in a metal ammo box. The next point is not a must, but I used as well a coating to make the drone less sensitive to water. It is from MG Chemical and it's called 422C. It will be used in the build process to coat the flight controller and the ESC. This way, even if you get a small splash of water during the flight, you don't have to be worried that the drone falls out of the sky. Lastly, you need the tools to build it. I have a set of small screwdrivers, which is perfect for building stuff like that. I can also recommend you this tool, which is perfect for repairs on the go and especially to mount the props. Next, you need a solder iron. I use the TS101, which is also portable and you can change the tips. I especially recommend you a bigger tip like this and a smaller one for smaller cables. Then you should get yourself flux, which makes the entire soldering process a lot easier. Next, I recommend you to get yourself solder with lead in it. This is not in every country available, but it makes the soldering process so much easier and the connections are more solid. The more environment friendly and healthier solder can be a bit trickier, but you can work with it too if you have no other option. And now we start with the build process. The first thing we have to do is to mount the frame together. Therefore, we first lay everything out nicely to get a good overview. And we start with the base plate. Therefore, we take all the screws out and all we need are these parts. This is the top plate, we don't need it at the moment. And we need these extensions and the screws. Now we put everything together. The first one is the bottom plate. Now these 5 screws hold the bottom plate together. Make sure that these 4 screws fit nicely in here, because here it should hold the stack. Now we tighten everything. Important is that you tighten these 5 screws so much that the counter screws here on the back side are entirely sunken in the carbon. This way you have a very solid build. Next we mount these extensions. Next the front part, but therefore we need the first 3D print. At this step the drone should look like something like this. You can put the top plate on it and now you get an idea how it should look like. Next we mount the guards on it, just like this. And what we need is this part and this one if you build the exact same drone, and this one. All the other parts we don't need in this build, so I put them away. Now we have to do some special work, because we want to have a GPS unit. When we mount everything into this, you don't have enough space for everything, because these extensions are not long enough. Because right here we have the mount for the O3, below of it the antenna mount for the ELRS receiver, and on top the antenna mount for the DJI O3. So we have to remove quite a bit here to fit this in as well. Therefore I need a China knife. Now I cut exactly this length of this GPS unit out of this part right here. And now it should look like this, quite a bit shorter. The next part we need is the DJI O3 Air unit. And this should fit perfectly right in here. The next step is to mount all together. The first part is the antenna mount for the ELRS. So we push it down. Next we need the GPS unit holder. Push it all the way down. Next, the O3 Air unit. Lastly, we need the antenna mount for the O3. And now push it over the extensions. Now we can mount the top plate and you see how it looks like. This way you get an idea how much space is left inside the drone for all the other parts. Now the next part we need is the brain of the drone, which is the PDB stack. And we have the ESC and the flight controller. And the accessories are right here. At this point you can decide if you want to run the cable below the stack or above the stack. So I go for below the stack. Let's try to mount everything in place. And right here you see a little arrow which should look in the front direction, like this. And now we have one problem, which is the condenser. You get one with the stack, but you don't have any space to fit it right here into the frame. It is too big for this frame. Because of that, I ordered a different one, which looks like this. But the problem is, it is the only one that I got, but it has a different mount. So we have to fiddle around here a little bit to make it fit evenly. If you order one by yourself, make sure that you get this mount and not this kind of mount. Because if you stretch it too much, it breaks down and then you have to get another one. This one is 35 volts and 470 microfarad. And it works very well. I had it in the first build as well. So let's try to get it out. Perfect. Now the next step before the solder process is to coat the downside of the ESC. Because after the soldering and you soldered the motors onto the ESC, it is not that easy to get it on the downside anymore. Because of that, we coat it right away. Now before you start with the coating, make sure to place the cable into the plugs, and the only part that should be coated are these two pads. Now let's take it out and start to coat it. And now it should look like this. Now it needs a few minutes until everything dries up. The next step is to solder the XT60 connection to the ESC, and that in a 45-degree angle, like this. This way the cable should stay like this when the ESC is mounted to the drone, which is exactly what we need. And therefore we use the bigger tip on the solder iron, because we need quite a bit of heat until these two pads are hot enough that the solder melts. Especially the minus pole, because it goes through the entire chip, which needs a lot more heat until the solder melts. Now first, let's take some flux and put it on the minus pole. Next, we heat this panel up simply by placing the tip onto the minus pole. Give it some solder. And now we take the cable and heat it up as well. And try to get it in a 45-degree angle. That looks quite solid. Let's change the angle a little bit more up. Like this. Let's do the same for the plus. So let's heat up the pad. But first we need some more flux on it. Now we thin the cable a little bit more. And that looks quite fine to me. Next, let's change the side and place some more solder right underneath it. We need some flux here as well to make it a bit easier. And that's it. Looks quite satisfying to me. Next we have to solder the condensator to this connection. Like this, because the black side means that's the minus pole. And the goal is that it fits right into this hole right here. So let's try that as well. Now first we place some solder onto these two connections right here. This way it holds a lot better onto this side. Now a little bit of flux right here as well. Now I place it onto this pad. Let's give it more solder. And now let's check if I can place it into the drone. And it looks not that bad. Needs some adjustment because the condenser is stuck right here, so we have to adjust it a little bit, but it looks not bad. And now it looks like this. Next I mounted the 4 nuts which were included with the 4 screws that hold the stack together, and let's see how it fits. Perfect. Next, let's place the flight controller on top. Make sure the 2 arrows from the stack look in the front direction, and I had to get 4 additional nuts to secure the stacks together, like this. So let's disassemble this, and next we move on with the motors. Now the screws are included. Let's open the first bag, and then we just mount the motors to the drone with the included screws. Make sure that they don't stick through the frame and stick into the motors, so make sure you use the shorter screws. And this place here is what you should check, that the screw doesn't stick into the motor. Now the next and most important step is to remove these pink screws and replace it with some black ones. And now we mount the DJI-O3 camera into the mount here at the front. I just tighten it enough so that I still can change the angle with my hands. Now we can move on to the next step, which is to coat the last little bit from the ESC down here. And now we can place it into the drone. Like this. Cable is in there, the downside is already coated, because the next step is to solder the motors onto the ESC, because after that you can't take it out that easily anymore. I personally solder around 350 degrees Celsius. Don't be worried if it doesn't look that clean if it is your first time that you try to solder. Important is that you have solid connections and that it doesn't connect with another solder connection. Now to solder the motors to the ESC, you first open the cables, stick it through this cable canal and stick it straight onto the drone. Next, we have to shorten the cables. Make sure that you have some reserve from the cable length, and then we cut it. Next, we take away some isolation, just a little bit. Now we spin the cables together. Next, we take the smaller solder iron for this one. First, we put some solder onto the wires. Heat it up and put some solder on it. Now it doesn't matter which cable comes to which pad. This only changes the motor direction, which you can't change in the software. But I place the first cable here, the second here, and the third one here. These first 3 pads are for the first front motor, and the next 3 are for the back motor. Now first, place some locks onto these 3 pads. Let's heat it up. Heat the solder up and place the cable. Now move on to the second pad. First heat it up, and now we place a little bit of solder onto the pad. Let's take the second cable and solder it onto the pad. Now the last pad. Again heat it up. And let's place the last cable onto the pad. Like this. And now we have to do exactly the same thing with all the other motors. And now we have soldered all the motor cables to the ESC. Next, I normally will coat as well the outside from the ESC around the cooler, but first we check if we have done everything correctly. Therefore, we first connect as well the flight controller to the ESC. And instead of connecting only the battery directly to the drone, we use a smoke stopper. This small part ensures that nothing can blow up. If something is not correct, you will hear it with a loud beep. We connect it to the XT60 connector, and now we put the battery in. And as you see, nothing smokes, everything looks fine. So we can move on. So now I coat as well everything outside from the cooling unit. Next, we disconnect the flight controller again and coat the downside of the flight controller. Make sure that nothing from the liquid comes into these different parts. Now we connect it again and place the flight controller on top. Now make sure the connection is steady. The next step is to connect the ELRS model. And as you see, we got as well a cable that we have to solder onto this chip and to the flight controller on the other side. But SpeedyBee is very good, so they delivered it with the separate cable that looks like this. We still have to solder it onto the chip, but not so onto the flight controller, because we got the connection right here. Let's connect this together. Now on the SpeedyBee website you will get the instruction where you exactly can see which cable comes to which plate onto the ELRS adapter. It is called Crossfire, but it's basically the same. Now let's start with the first connection, which is ground. It should be the black cable. Now first we put there a little bit of solder, heat it up and get some solder on it. Let's use some flux, which makes everything a little bit easier. Just put it over all the connections. Let's give a little bit more solder onto the pad. Just like this. Now we take the black cable and solder it onto it. Just like that. The next one is the 5 volt. So we take a little bit more solder and place it onto the 5 volt pad. Like this. And we take the rack cable, solder it onto it. Next is TX, which should be the white cable. So let's first put some solder on it, take the white cable and solder it onto it. And the last one. Just take a little bit of flux and make the connections a little bit prettier than they are right now. Perfect, that's it. And now let's mount this little part into the drone. Therefore, we first put it through this hole with the entire chip. And now we can connect antenna right into this holder down here. And here we go. Next we take this plastic part, move it over the chip and the connections. And with a little bit of fire, we make it a little bit more waterproof. And now we already have installed the ELRS module. The only thing to do is to spin the cable a few times to get a more solid connection, so it does not interfere with other signals inside the drone as much as when you don't spin it. And now all we have to do is to connect it simply to this plug. And now we have the connection all ready to the ELRS module. I take this cable back between the ESC and the flight controller to the backside. Now next we install the GPS module. Now therefore move this GPS cable through to this back part right here. Just like that. Next we connect it to the GPS unit itself, which is this small part, and the sticker with the antenna side should be facing up. Now we simply connect it and place the GPS unit inside the holder. Now we have to do some soldering again. Move the cables to the front and we start spinning it like the other cables, which is very important, especially with the GPS unit, because the GPS unit works a lot better if you spin the cables. And now again, like before, let's put some flux on it first. Should make everything a lot easier. We heat the pad up like this. Take the red cable and solder it onto it. Make sure you work with tweezers, this way you don't burn your fingers. Now let's make the ground, which is the black cable. Here it is very important that you get solid connections, not that two cables connect together. Let's take the black one and connect it again. Now the T6 should be the white cable. Again, all the connections are visible in the manual. Now let's make some solder onto the pad. Let's solder the next pad. This should be the yellow cable. That looks great. Now we have two cables left. The SDA should be the blue one. Now let's take the blue cable and put it on the SDA pad. Next the green one. And that's it. Now we successfully connected the GPS unit to the flight controller. If you have a cable that is long enough from the GPS unit right until to this block, you can connect it as well and you don't have to solder it. But I don't have any cable that is long enough to connect it from here to here, so I had to solder it. The next step is to connect the DJI O3 Air unit to the flight controller, and to save you a lot of time and research, I highly recommend you to disconnect the yellow cable that you see here on the plug, because if you use the exact same flight controller and you fly with ELRS, you have to disconnect it, otherwise it doesn't connect to the ELRS. Now therefore we simply just remove the yellow cable. And now we simply have to plug it into this plug right down here. And now I just stick it to the other cables with a little bit of electrical tape. This way you can use it again if you ever wish to fly with the DJI controller. Now let's secure the entire stack with additional nuts. Not too tight, but also not too loose. And now we successfully mounted everything together except for the beeper. Now the beeper comes in a little box like this, and it includes the beeper itself, a cable and the cable tie, as well as the manual. In here you see exactly where you have to connect which cable. We have ground, BZ plus and BZ minus. So let's solder it onto the flight controller. Now right here on the flight controller you see ground, BZ plus and BZ minus. Let's first apply some flux and let's start with the ground. Heat the panel up. Let's take the black cable and solder it onto the ground. The red cable goes on BZ plus. So let's heat it up and solder it onto BZ plus. And the yellow cable goes on the BZ minus pad. So let's heat it up. That looks good. Next we just connect the cable to the beeper. Make sure it is tight enough. And now we mount the beeper right in here with the cable tie. Make sure that you can reach the button when the top plate is on. Now we place it right in here. Tighten the cable tie. And now the drone is nearly finished. Let's mount the top plate and the strap. And now we just stick the battery grip onto the drone. The GoPro mount. And now one last check with smoke stopper, so let's connect it. And everything sounds fine. And now let's try it without the smoke stopper. And as you hear, it beeps. So to stop the beeping, simply press onto the button. And now it stops. This way you can hear your drone when you lose it. Let's try it without the smoke stopper. Sounds good. And now we are done. Congrats, you built your first drone completely by yourself. And now let's start with all the programming, and after that you can code the top side from the flight controller as well if you want to. Now let's start with the first step. We have to flash the ESC from the drone. We work with BL Heli, which is discontinued, but you are still able to flash your ESC. So you have to download the BL Heli configurator, which I will link in the description. If you click on the link, you will see this site, and in here you can download it for Windows, Mac or even Linux. Now as soon as the BL Heli suite is open and the drone connected to the laptop, we connect the LiPo to the drone. This way the ESC has power, otherwise it doesn't work. Now we connect it. Next we flash BL Heli. And as you see, everything was successful. Press OK, and that's it. In here you can even change the motor directions for each separate motor, but we want that the front motor spin inwards, and I'll tell you why later. Now we disconnect it and disconnect the battery again. Next we have to flash the ELRS receiver, this way your drone get a connection to the controller. So just type in ELRS configurator and the first page should be the correct one, and simply download the software right here, which I already have. Then we start up the program. This entire process works the best with the RadioMaster hardware. If you use another manufacturer, it can get more complicated and you have to Google a lot. To avoid it, just use the same hardware as I use. Now in here we first have to choose the latest firmware. Next we have to choose the device category, which is RadioMaster 2.4 GHz. Next the device itself, which is the RP1. Then we select Wi-Fi. Now the next important step is to select if you want to fly in Europe or in the FCC mode. The FCC mode has more power, but it's not allowed to use it in Europe. So you have to decide this for yourself. Next we choose a binding phrase, which should be the same on all your drones and the controller. This way, if you connect another drone, it automatically binds to your controller, which is very cool. And next we choose build. Next you copy this file and save it to the desktop. Next, if you open your Wi-Fi settings, you will see Express LRS. If you get asked for a password, it is Express LRS. Now select it and it will open this window. Now you can select Update, and now just drag and drop this file into this window and select Update. This can take a few minutes. Wait until the Wi-Fi Express LRS is gone and it returns back. Now it should be finished. We go back to the ELRS Wi-Fi 3.4.3. So we have successfully updated the ELRS receiver. The next thing we have to do is to update the DJI O3 Air unit. Therefore we disconnect the drone and connect it to the O3 Air unit. Then you need to install the DJI Assistant. And now we see the O3 Air unit right here. Just select it and start the activation. In here you have to register it with your account. Next select it and upgrade it to the latest firmware. If you use your goggles for the first time, you probably have to update it as well in the same software. And that's it. Now we close this software again and move on with Betaflight. And now we start with the Betaflight, and the first thing you have to do is to download the software. It's called the Betaflight configurator. I'll link it down below as well. Now as soon as you install the configurator and open it, we can connect the drone. Then the first step is to choose Update Firmware. And now we select Auto Detect. This way it auto detects all the used components in your drone, which you see right here. And then we have to select Load Firmware. And this was successful. The next step, very important, is to disconnect the drone and press on the bootloader button on the flight controller and simultaneously connect the drone. Now you are in the bootloader mode. We can click on Flash Firmware. And now it erases everything which was on the chip and flashes it with the latest firmware. Now, as you see, it was successful. Next we go to the Welcome tab and click on Connect. Now you get an error message, which is totally normal. The next thing is to ensure that the drone is on a leveled surface and then press Calibrate. And now when we move the drone, it should act as you see on the display. Now the drone is calibrated and knows where is up and down. And next we go to the tab Ports. In here you can select all the same settings which I have selected for my drone if you used all the same components. Otherwise you have to Google which UARTs are for which parts. Very important, always hit save and reboot. This way everything gets saved to the drone. Otherwise, if you move on directly to the next tab, all your settings don't get saved to the drone. Next we go to configuration, and in here make also sure that all the sliders and numbers are correctly matched as mine. Next we go to power and battery, and the same as well here. Next we go to failsafe. In here you can select what should happen if the connection is lost between the drone and the controller. In here you can choose between drop, which means the motors will stop and the drone falls out of the sky. Or you can choose land, which means the drone will automatically land with the chosen throttle value, which you have to find out by yourself at which value the drone starts to sink. Or what I recommend is to choose GPS rescue. So this way it will return to the home point. Ensure also here that all the settings are exactly the same. And after each tab, I recommend you to always press save and reboot. This way all the settings are saved. Next we go to the presets, and in here you search for OSD and you have to select OSD for FPV. This creates your OSD, which means you see all the important settings in your goggles. But we dive a little bit later into this topic. Simply pick it and you are good to go. Next we search for ELRS. And it is very important that you choose your correct link frequency. I personally fly with 150 Hz, which means you have a relatively high reach, but also a relatively high delay. You can get even a higher reach, which means you have to fly with 50 Hz, but there you can notice a slight delay, which is not always the best case. If you want no delay, you can select 1000 Hz. This way you have no delay, but also not a lot of reach. So just select 150 Hz, and in here you can choose between freestyle or cinematic. I personally fly with cinematic. Then just select cinematic and pick it, which I already have done. Now let's move on to the pit tuning. And the presets for the ELRS, which we have chosen the 150 Hz, are affecting these settings right here. You don't have to put it in manually. If you select the ELRS 150 Hz cinematic, it automatically affects these sliders. Now next you see my pit tuning for this quad, which I am very happy with it. It flies amazing, so you can copy my settings or fine tune it to your taste. But this way it flies perfectly. So also here ensure that all the settings look exactly the same. Next we go to the rate profiles. I fly with two different rate profiles, so I have a switch on my controller which I can switch between rate profile 1, which is more aggressive, and rate profile 2, which is less aggressive and gives you smoother results. Now you can select the same rates as I have or use the one you already used in the simulator. If you're just starting out, I recommend you to start with my less aggressive rates, but generally this is a matter of taste. And next we can go to the filter settings, and in here you can copy all my settings as well. That are the settings which I figured out works the best for this quad. Because of that, make sure you use the same, you can always change it later on. Now we go to the receiver tab, and next we need the controller. I link you down below as well a video how to install everything on your controller. Then we disconnect the drone first and start up the controller. And then we connect the drone again to Betaflight. Now we go back to the receiver tab, and now if you move any stick, you should see that it reacts to all your movement. This means your drone and your controller are already bound and ready to go. In here also check that all the settings are exactly the same, especially the telemetry slider, but everything else as well. Now we can hit save and go to the modes tab. In here you have a lot of different modes. Now the first one is on my switch right here, which is arm. So if I have the switch up, the drone is armed and ready to fly, which you can see with this little yellow line. In this area it is armed, and when I move the switch back down, it is disarmed. And this is my aux channel 1, which you also can see in the receiver tab. If you use any switch, let's say this one, you can see which aux channel you are using right now. I use the aux 1 for arming and disarming. Now next we have the angle mode, which I have on a 3-position switch. The first position is the normal acro mode, which is a normal FPV drone. If I switch it to the middle position, we are in angle mode. And if I switch it one higher, I will activate the GPS rescue mode. And this has a reason behind it, because in acro mode you can fly on the head or whatever you want. And if you have a dangerous situation, you can flip the switch and you are in angle mode. So you know where is top and where is the bottom. And if something even better happens, you use the switch again and go into GPS rescue, which means the drone will probably come back to you. Next I have as well the flip over after crash. That means if you have a crash and the drone lands like this, you can press the button on the controller and only 2 motors start spinning so that the drone is upright again. I personally have it on aux 6, which is this small button behind here. And that's it for the modes, more I don't use. Let's move on to adjustments. In here I show you how we can switch between 2 different rate profiles. So I use an empty switch, which is this one, and therefore we go back to receiver and I use this switch. Now we can see it is aux 3. Now go back to adjustments, and then first we select this one, go to aux 3 and extend this bar over the first position. And in here you can select what it should be doing. Now let's open this drop down menu and search for rate profile selection. And by via channel we select again aux 3. Now we select the second slider, aux 3, move it 1 up and extend this yellow bar over this smaller one. Go to the drop down menu and search for rate profile selection. Via channel 3 again and press save. Now we go back to the pit tuning tab, go to rate profiles, and now you can see you can switch between rate profile 1, 2 or even 3 if you have a 3-way switch. But that works for me fine, so I hit save and we move on with the GPS tab. But as you can see in my house it doesn't work, otherwise you will see your location right here. So we move on directly to the motors. Now in here we have to check if we have soldered the motor cables correctly to the ESC. You will see it if the motor spins not in the correct direction. And it is very important to never use this function with any props on. So always keep your props dismounted if you use this function. Now first, make sure that all the settings are the same like mine, especially the Shot 600. Next we have to mount the battery to the drone. And now we activate this slider. Now if you move one slider up, one motor spins. The front props should spin inwards, and I tell you later why this is very important. Now you can see that the first motor spins in this direction. If you can't see it, use any paper and you can see in which direction the motor spins. This direction, which means the 2 props behind should spin in this direction and the 2 props in front should spin inwards. Now this one is perfect. Let's move the second slider. And now, because it spins very fast, you can't see in which direction it spins. So we use the paper and it spins inwards, which is correct. So we move on to the next motor, move the slider up and it spins outwards, which is correct as well. Move on to the last motor. And you can see it spins in this direction, which is inwards, that is correctly. Now we are sure that the motor spins in the correct direction. You can use the master slider, this way all 4 motors spin simultaneously. You can also reverse the motor directions, which means these 2 motors spin outwards and these 2 back here spin inwards, which I don't recommend you will see why. Or you can change a single motor direction if you don't have soldered it correctly. Go to motor direction. Yes, I understand the risk, so no props. Individually, select one, and you can reverse it if you need to. But I have soldered it correctly, so I don't need it. Now I disconnect the LiPo again, stop the beeper, and we move on with the OSD, which means what you see in the goggles. And in here you can see how my layout looks, and you can choose all the same settings. Very important is to use the HD function and not the PAL, otherwise you have a very weird aspect ratio and very big symbols, so always use the HD. And in here you can see all my relevant data that I have chosen. Up here in the first line I have all my informations about the controller connection. Down here I have the mode, which is acro, angle or air mode, the low voltage warning, my battery status, the direction to home, how many satellites I have, the altitude, the coordinates, and that's roughly it. So but one additional point I want to add, which is GPS speed. So just select it. And now you can move it to the position where you want to see it, right here. Again, here you can see all my settings. Make sure that you use the same if you want to have the same layout, or simply remove or add everything you want. Then hit save, and then we move on to the video transmitter tab. So in here I have changed nothing, so let it like it is. In here you can use it for LED stripes, but I don't use it, so I don't care. Next one is sensors. As well, in here I have changed nothing. Next one as well, nothing important. In here you can read out the data if you want to analyze your flying behavior even more in detail, but this is an entire topic for itself, so we let that out for this video. Next, the CLI. This is a program monitor. In here you can program everything what you want. You can create backups and a lot more, but this is not relevant for this topic. And now we are done with the programming. The drone is ready to fly. Just code the top side from the flight controller if you want to, then mount the props, charge your LiPos, get your goggles and your controller and start to fly. And now you finally can start using it. I know it needs some effort, but it's worth it. And now you're also able to repair it by yourself. I record always in a flat profile at 25 frames per second with the fixed shutter speed according to the 180-degree rule and the fixed ISO, which requires the use of ND filters. And I fix as well the white balance and record in the 8:7 aspect ratio. The internal stabilization in the GoPro always should be turned off. This way you can stabilize it with gyroflow, which gives you the best results. If you want to learn everything about filmmaking, even how to grade footage, not only GoPro footage, but I mean really learn how to get results like this without relying on LUTs alone, I recommend you checking out our online course, All in Filmmaker. For our members, we even have a new FPV LUT pack. Yes, which still needs some fine-tuning like every other LUT on every other camera, but you will learn how to fix that. But even more interesting, we provide there as well a Betaflight dump file which stores all the settings for this exact drone. So you don't have to adjust all the sliders and settings manually. You just paste it into the CLI and you're good to go. And we also provide these dump files for all other drones I use. Now you got yourself a very high quality 5-inch drone, which is amazing for most of the use cases. I personally own a few drones in the meantime, even a very small one with a naked GoPro on it, which is called the Cinelog 25V2, which is more to fly indoors, and it has covered props, which makes it a very safe drone, but not as fast and not as wind resistant like a 5-inch. Because with the 5-inch you can't fly indoors. Well, you can, but you better don't try it. So there are different drone types for different use cases. Can become quite pricey at some point, yes, but there are better drones for some shots. If you want to fly close to persons, the 5-inch isn't the best option, because the props are open, which is too dangerous in my opinion. For such shots I use the Cinelog 35V2. It is really not that fast like a 5-inch, but it's a lot safer if you touch a person, and it is a bit wobblier. So a Cinewhoop isn't made for crazy active shots, more for smoother shots and gaps. But for longer ranges and more flight time, a big quad makes more sense, something like the Moss 7. It is way more efficient and built for longer ranges. As you see, not every drone is perfect for every scenario. Now let's start with my biggest learnings I had so far. I'm by no means a pro in flying FPV, but through the process and more than a half-year experience, I definitely learned some points that I wished to know before, which saved me a lot of time, money, troubles, research and the entire drone with the GoPro. So let's start with the first one. Keep an eye on your cable management before you fly, otherwise it can happen that the prop cuts into a cable, which can become very annoying, especially if you have to repair a battery balance adapter, or even worse, the main power cable from the drone itself, which both happened to me. I had luck that I simply used electrical tape to fix it and I didn't have to solder it again, so keep an eye on it. The same for the battery strap, make sure it sits close to the body from the drone. One time I started it and it sounded very weird, so I immediately landed in a very high middle, which brings me to the next point. Then I looked for the drone. In the other hand I had the controller. After some time I found it, picked it up and tried to disconnect the battery. However, somehow I touched the arm button on the controller from the drone and after 1 second I saw the drone high in the sky and immediately disarmed. This is really the worst case that can happen. Luckily I didn't hurt someone else or myself. Did you ever touch into spinning blades from a drone? This can become a real mess. I know how it feels with the simple Mavic, but FPV is even worse. So every time you pick up your drone and disconnect it from the battery, place your controller at a safe place where you don't can arm it by accident, or so that it didn't can fall down and arm it by itself. Normally it doesn't arm when you have the throttle at 0, but in this case it armed, or I somehow even managed to give some throttle after arming. So really place the controller somewhere safe if you want to keep your fingers. As already mentioned, it is important for our use case to fly with the front prop spinning inwards. I also hear that front props out is the way to go, because if you hit stuff like trees or bushes, it doesn't smash everything into your camera lens, which sounds logical. When I had my front prop spinning outwards and I had my first mountain dive, I experienced something weird. That at some point the drone doesn't want to sink straight down anymore. It gives automatically throttle until I was straight in the air again for a while, which makes a mountain dive with the nose from the drone straight down impossible. And I for myself can't figure out why, and at the end I asked a pro in FPV and he immediately saw that I had the front prop spinning out, and he told me I should try it with the front prop spinning in. And yes, what should I say, he was totally right. This fixed this issue directly, so always let's spin your front props inwards and you never get this problem, because this way Betaflight works the best way. Next, I really never had huge crashes, but the most crashes I had was during the start. One point to be aware of is if you start on a surface which is not leveled, the drone also starts with this angle, and this means it automatically flies in this direction if you don't counter for it, which can be awkward if you don't know it. Next, really make use of the GPS coordinates on the controller. It happens a lot that you have a small crash and you have to pick up your drone. If you crashed on a big field, you definitely will find your drone a lot faster. Now the last and for me most expensive point was to learn always stay in line of sight and know where you are. Let's say you are at an amazing location and all you want is to get the shot. You start, you get it and you want to return, but you don't know exactly where you are. Exactly because of that I lost my first build, and that at the start of a holiday, which was a very bad day, but it is what it is. At least I learned something. Especially if you fly longer ranges, always look back and give you some time to remember certain points to get the rotation in which direction you should fly back, even if you have only 3 packs with you. So keep in mind, it is a dangerous drone compared to a normal DJI, so always decide for safety even if that means you lose a drone. You don't want to harm others or yourself, that's the last thing this activity needs. So that was my biggest learning so far, and I definitely will integrate more FPV footage in my videos in the future. I hope you learned something or it helped you to build your own premium FPV quad. If you liked it, feel free to subscribe, and as always, let's create.